So let's take a look at Hebrews. And the old joke used to be, who wrote Paul's epistle to the Hebrews? The general idea is that Paul isn't the author of this epistle. We know it as an epistle, but it's essentially a sermon. It doesn't have the character and the marks of an epistle. We have no introductory remarks, no identification of the individual concerned. So it has a sermonic form. And of course, the debate then is around who is the preacher. The use of the Greek is very high. So it's a very educated style of Greek language, very marked so. So it's a very interesting question then, who is the preacher? But the sermon itself takes as its theme the excellence of the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the preacher wants to draw two things out about the person of Jesus Christ. And the first is simply stated, and then the second is developed throughout the sermon. So the first thing he wants to tell you about the person of the Lord Jesus Christ is found in chapter 1 and in the second verse, where you read, in these last days, so that's God, in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. So the sermon presents us with Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, equal in majesty and glory with God, the brightness and the visibility of God, but he is the last word. So God has spoken in times past through the prophets in different ages. God has given, if you like, different installments over the centuries of his revelation. But here we are, we have the final word in the person of Jesus Christ. Nothing else will ever come from God which is not found in this revelation of his Son. So that's the first thing the preacher wants you to know. And then the second thing that preoccupies him in this sermon is the excellence of the person of Jesus Christ as high priest. And what the preacher wants to develop in his sermon is the idea that Jesus Christ is high priest after the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious figure that we encounter in Genesis, to whom Abraham offers tithes when he returns from the battlefield as a victor. That is the model for the high priestly ministry of Jesus. And the preacher wants to develop that. He wants to draw on the Old Testament, not just the passage on Melchizedek, but he wants to draw on the passages to do with Moses and to do with Joshua and to do with all the temple and descriptions and the legislation around the temples and the priestly teachings. He wants to draw all of that together to present his readers with the majesty of Jesus as the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And this is what you see then when you take a look at the sermon itself. So in chapter 5 and verses 9 through to 14, we have the preacher identifying his main theme. So you can see it if we read from verse 9. So he's discussing the nature of priesthood and how Jesus Christ as high priest had to suffer. He did not glorify himself, but God glorified him. He did not take the role of high priest to himself, but he was given to him by God. So the preacher is warming to his theme. And then verse 9, he says this, having been perfected, this is Jesus Christ, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest. So here's Jesus now called by God as high priest. And there it is, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, here he is. He's warming to his theme, but he brings in a note of warning. And the warning is this, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. So the problem for the preacher is his audience. He's full of passion about his subject. He sees the importance of teaching them about the high priestly ministry of Jesus. He recognizes that it's a tough subject, that theologically is going to demand his audience's attention and concentration. But he's also aware that the biggest obstacle to the people he's preaching to grasping what he's saying is their own spiritual condition. And he describes it for us. So verse 12, chapter 5. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a baby. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. So here's his dilemma. How is he going to bring this wonderful teaching about Christ as a Melchizedek high priest when his hearers have become slow? Now, they're slow in their thinking, they're slow in grasping theological truth, and they haven't matured since they were first brought to Christ. So here's his problem. And if you turn to chapter 8 and verse 1, you see that he comes back to his main theme. He's again saying, now look, this is what I want to be preaching to you about. I want to speak to you about Jesus, the high priest, after the order of Melchizedek. So chapter 8 and verse 1. Now this is the main point of the things we have been saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected and not man. So can you see, he on two occasions brings his audience to the point where they again are told what is the main purpose of our preacher's sermon. It's to present them with Jesus in this way. So how does he go about trying to teach an audience who seem to lack the capacity, the maturity to understand what he is saying? And he does two things. He gives them a number of warnings, and he warns them about the dangers of them remaining in this spiritually lethargic and immature condition. And then he offers encouragements. He urges, he presses them forward. He uses imagery, which has the sense of reaching out, marching, continuing to run, pressing forward. He's urging them on. So you've got the negative warning bits, and then you've got the positive encouraging bits, as he seeks to cajole his audience into being receptive to his message. And as he does that, he then, through the middle of both, he gives them his theological teaching. And in the middle of this sermon, you get chapter after chapter. The jest contains theology, and he's working out for his audience why it is so essential that Jesus should be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So imagine him steering his ship. He has rocks and dangers on the one hand, so there's the warnings. Then he has the direction he wants to go to. He wants them to be grasping and moving forward and remaining steadfast, and he then has to drive the ship of his theological teaching in between the two as he gives the doctrine that he's so keen to bring to them. That's the idea then, okay? So what I want us to do first of all is look at the warnings. Then we'll take a glance at the encouragements, those passages that are urging his audience forward, and then we'll examine the theology that is neatly contained in a number of chapters. So if we take a look at the warnings then, okay? So we've seen that his audience are dull of hearing, hard of hearing, spiritually immature. So let's plot the warnings that he gives to them. And the first of them is found in chapter 2. And this is a very famous warning, verses 1 to 4. And it's one that you should be familiar with, and we've thought about many times. And it's the warning against drifting away. And you know the imagery. The imagery is that of a rowing boat, maybe a small vessel of some kind, moored on the side perhaps of a river, and it's tied to its moorings with a rope. That rope slips from its mooring and the boat drifts along with the tide. That's the warning about spiritual drift. And that drift occurs as a result of neglecting our salvation. And we've said many times, Christian people don't dramatically, as a rule, and sort of spectacularly fall away. The rule is it's a gradual, almost imperceptible drift that occurs in the lives of Christian people. And it takes a while to notice that somebody's on the outward tide. And before you know it, you can just about see another Christian on the horizon as they drift out of sight. That's the first warning. So it's chapter 2, 1 to 14. And then if you take the second warning, you find it in chapter 3. And the second warning runs from verse 12 down to verse 19, and it's a warning against unbelief. So let's take a look, chapter 3 and verse 12. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Now exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And he just kind of backs that warning up by referring to Moses and the Israelites as they wandered through the desert for 40 years. Unbelief is the danger there. So can you see how he's building his warning passages? The first is against drift. The second warning passage is against unbelief. And then the third warning passage we've already noted. It's in chapter 5, so it begins with this description of their spiritual condition, and then the warning extends from the end of chapter 5 into chapter 6, and it reaches as far as verse 8. And this one traditionally has been amongst the scariest and most challenging of the warnings to understand and to make use of. So let's summarize the warning like this. Go to chapter 6 and verse 4, and just take the first line of verse 4. For it is impossible for those. Then go down to verse 6 and take the first phrase. If they fall away, to renew them again to repentance. So this warning is about the impossibility of renewing those who fall away from Christ. There's your third warning. Very scary. If you then take a look at the fourth warning, you find it in chapter 10, and it begins at verse 26. And this is a warning against the dangers of not assembling together, not meeting together for acts of worship. So chapter 10, verse 26, for if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. And as you go down, then you see about the whole idea of meeting together and so on, and the judgment of God. That's your fourth warning. And then the final one. Turn to chapter 12, and we've got an extended warning that begins in chapter 12 and verse 3. And it extends down, I think, as far as verse 17. And this is the warning about the need to endure hardship. It's a warning against being complacent, being lazy, but also it's a warning against saying things like, oh, I can't run because I've hurt my ankle. Or I can't run because I've twisted my foot. I can't run the race of faith because my knees are aching or my shoulder's hurting. It's using the imagery of an athlete and of how an athlete is to continue on his course no matter how much his feet ache and his arms hurt and whatever else is happening to him, he must continue to run. And the preacher, in bringing in this fifth warning, he brings in the idea of discipline. And it's a very controversial idea. It's the idea that God disciplines his people, as a coach would discipline an athlete, as a father would discipline a son, so God seeks to discipline his children. And to be disciplined by God is a sign that you are legitimate. Because why would any father take the trouble, so the preacher reasons, why would any father take the trouble to raise and nurture and discipline a child that doesn't belong to him? So the very fact that a father takes trouble with a son is proof that the father is owning and identifying that son as his. So he takes that up into the spiritual realm, and God knows who are his, and he disciplines us. And of course, the great discussion point there is, how does God discipline his children? How does he prove to us that we are legitimate? What form does the discipline take? So those are the 5 warning passages then. And if we just run alongside that, the encouragement passages. Now, these are scattered throughout the sermon. He sort of dips into an encouragement every so often, like just a sentence or so. But you can see a great deal of encouragement in certain patches, if you like. And you see a lot of them in chapter 4. So let's just drop into chapter 4. And the encouraging passages, those that are urging you to press on and to endure, are usually prefixed with let us. Let us do this and let us do that and let us come and so on. It's this urging of collective action on part of himself as the preacher and his audience to press on and to move forward. So you can see it, can't you, as you go down chapter 4. Let us, we have in verse 11, let us be diligent. And then we have let us in verse 16, let us come boldly to the throne of grace. Hold fast, come to God, find the help you need, come to the throne of grace. All these urging and insisting passages that we have. Turn across to chapter 10. And you have exactly the same idea here, the let us phrases. And it's a really useful thing to do if you're a preacher, is to examine the let us statements in Hebrews and to use them as you then deliver a sermon. So if you turn to Hebrews 10, just take a look at them again, okay? Verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Verse 24, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. So, here are the positive urgings of the preacher to go forward, set against the background of those warnings. So you can say the same in chapter 12 of Hebrews and verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the idea that you consider. So chapter 3, verse 1, you consider. Chapter 12, you do the same, you consider. Okay, you're urged to action. So those are the 2 sort of extremes. The middle ground is the theological teaching. And what I want us to see is, what is the theological teaching that we have. So just take a look then in the sermon as a whole. And what you find is there's a lot of introduction. So chapter 1 is introduction, chapter 2 is warning. Chapter 3, he sort of gets to closer to his theme, I guess. So chapter 3, verse 1, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus, who is faithful. Now, he kind of goes on a little tangent there, and he talks about the faithfulness of Jesus over his house. He dips into Moses, he dips into to Joshua, he dips into the idea of rest, but he's not there yet. Okay, in chapter 3, chapter 4, he's not there. He hasn't arrived at the main body of his sermon. The main body of his sermon, the theological meat of his sermon, if you like, starts in chapter 6 and verse 13, and then it extends through chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, and he rounds off his teaching at verse 18 of chapter 10. So that's the heart of his sermon, and that's the weight of his theology found in those chapters. So there's a great deal to consider in chapter 2 about the captain of our salvation, about chapter 3, Christ is faithful, chapter 4, Joshua and rest, Jesus and rest. You know, wonderful chapters full of theological insight. But it's the body of his sermon where our preacher comes to his main theme. And he wants to tell us about the inadequacy of the old covenant, how the old covenant with the temple and the sacrifices and the priestly system was all inadequate. And he spells out the reasons why. So, for example, the animal sacrifices could never be in and of themselves sufficient to bring in the remission of sins. How could the blood of an animal fully atone for human sin? And then, you know, for what they were worth, they were delaying or deferring the wrath of God, but they were only doing so temporarily. So you kept having to repeat the sacrifices. So year after year, month after month, the sacrifices were done, and the most that they could achieve was just suspending the wrath of God for a period of time. So it's the inadequacy of the animal sacrificial system that he wants to talk about in the Old Covenant. But then he also wants to emphasize the inadequacy of the priestly system, the sons of Levi. Why were they an inadequate priesthood? And so he wants to talk about the idea that the high priest would have been chosen from amongst men, and the high priest was chosen because he was a man like any other. He was tested and he was tempted and he was weak and he was sinful. So this high priest had to be like us, because otherwise he couldn't identify with us, he couldn't sympathize with us, he couldn't represent us. He couldn't really be our man in the presence of God unless he was the same as us. But of course that presents then, doesn't it, a very serious problem. Because if the high priest, in order to be a good high priest, has to be like us, then surely that means he would also have to offer sacrifices for his own sins. He'd have to do something about his own sins, wouldn't he? As well as thinking about our sins. So really, this high priest who has to be like us and he's chosen from amongst men, he's got a problem because he's sinful like we are. So how do you resolve that then? How can this high priest be effective if at the same time he's sinful? But then the preacher comes up with another problem with the high priest, and that is that he's only in the job for a year. And after a year, he's replaced, and then you get somebody else. And what if the next one isn't as good as the one before? And what if the next one dies and then he's only there for another year? So you've got another high priest and another high priest. So you've got no continuity at all. You have no permanent representation before God. There isn't one voice that is representing you before God and then bringing the blessings of God and the mercy of God and the grace of God from God to you. It's this continual need for replacement, as well as the fact that the person is sinful, so has to atone for themselves. So here's the problem, says our preacher. The sacrificial system is inadequate. The high priestly system is inadequate. In fact, the whole old covenant just isn't up to it. It doesn't do the job. It's not fit for purpose. So we need a new covenant. And in needing a new covenant, we are going to need a new high priest, and we're going to need a new sacrificial system, and we may even need a new temple. Well, our preacher will lay out for us how all of that is achieved through the person of Jesus Christ, and it's achieved in his person because he is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So if you take chapter 7 then, and where are we? Verse 16. And here is our preacher now resolving the problem of the fact that the old high priest, the Aaronic, sons of Aaron, the Levites, whoever they are, they would die or they would only last a year. But look at what he tells us about Jesus. Like Melchizedek, verse 16, he is come not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So there's problem solved. We have in Jesus an endless life, the power of a high priest who is eternal, without beginning and without end. So we don't have to replace him. We don't have to wish for another. He has a continuous and eternal ministry at the right hand of God. And then he solves the problem about the sinfulness of all of us, because Jesus can be a high priest. He can represent us, he can be like us, he can be chosen because he shares our nature. He was made like us. He is the captain of our salvation. He became flesh. So he shares in our nature. So he can be both eternal and human, because he is both God and he is man. And he suffered and was made perfect through his experience in order that he might then be compassionate and sympathetic as a high priest. So can you see how Jesus completely solves the problem that you had with the old priesthood? They were sinners and they were temporary. Jesus is perfect, he's God and man, and he's eternal. So he solves that problem. What about the problem with the animals and the sacrifices? They have the blood of goats and sheep. It was never sufficient. It could only defer the wrath of God. Well, of course, what we have in the teaching of our preacher is that Jesus Christ is not only the high priest, but he's also the sacrifice. He sacrifices himself. He offers up his own blood on the altar. So turn to chapter 9, and we'll read from verse 11. So Hebrews 9 and verses 11 forward. But Christ came as the high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Now, look how much is there. The temple, the old temple, is insufficient, so we've got a new temple. It's not made with hands. It's eternal. It's a heavenly temple. We have a heavenly high priest. And then he offers himself through the Spirit as an eternal sacrifice, offering his blood for atonement. Christ is so much better than what we had before. And the covenant that he brings, you see it there, is so much greater than what went before. And the preacher will talk in the rest of chapter 9 about how his death was necessary. We didn't have the death of the high priest in the Old Testament, but here is Christ dying as the sacrifice. And it's important that his life is offered, not just his blood, but his life. And then you have the sufficiency of his sacrifice in chapter 9, and then more in chapter 10 about the insufficiency of the animal sacrifice. But did you notice in chapter 9, the preacher makes another point? I mean, this is an important one, isn't it? And we've got it there, once for all. And if we just have a look through those verses, verse 12, now not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all. And you know, you have that repeated elsewhere in the sermon, that what Christ did is sufficient as a once-off act. So his death is sufficient to atone for sin. His offering of his life is sufficient. His return to heaven, and heaven is depicted as a temple. And Christ, in returning to heaven, is pictured as the high priest who enters the temple with his the blood of as a sacrifice. Christ is pictured going into the heavenly temple with the blood, his own blood, as an atonement for sacrifice. Just like the old covenant, the high priest would go into the holy place and sprinkle the Ark of the Covenant. So Christ goes into heaven and he sprinkles with his own blood, and he does it once. There's no need for repeated sacrifices. There's nothing to do with insufficiency here. Christ is perfect, sufficient, and he solves or resolves all the inadequacies and the tensions and the failures of the old covenant. And this is what our preacher is exhorting his audience to understand. And he rounds it all off in chapter 10, verses 11 through to 18. This is where the theology is rounded off. Every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. And of course, the old covenant couldn't take them away. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. From that time, waiting till his enemies are made his footstool. For by one offering, he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also witnesses to us. For after he said before, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their mouths I will write them. And he adds, their sins and their lawless deeds I remember no more. And here's his conclusion, okay, his theological conclusion in this sermon. Now, where there is remission of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. It's all done. So we don't need Roman Catholics recreating the crucifixion in their mass. You don't need to contribute anything to your own forgiveness. You don't need to offer your works or your praise or your promises to seek to add to what Christ has done. Forgiveness doesn't come through your own confession or through your own anything. It's all once for all through Christ, who is the perfect high priest. And there is the burden of our sermon. So he rounded off with the fifth and final warning. And then chapter 11 and chapter 13, they are sort of standalone moments in the sermon where he tries to prove, and he does it successfully, that this was always foreseen in the Old Testament. So he quotes lots of verses, quotes lots of characters in order to demonstrate that this has always been God's purpose, it was always God's plan, and people were always brought to salvation through faith, not through the sacrifices and not through the temple, but through faith. So he demonstrates that. And chapter 11, you know it, it's the gallery of those who've gone before, the cloud of witnesses. There's no exhortation there, mind you, it's just a picture gallery of previous saints. And then chapter 13, chapter 13 is seen by many as either an add-on later on, when the sermon was put into written form, or if it was delivered at the same time, then it's got a feel of a kind of a list of, or a summarizing of, okay, in the light of all this theology, then this is what we need to be like, okay? So he's urged them throughout. And then he seems to end things with a whole set of instructions, still drawing on the Old Testament background of the sacrificial system and the temple system, but bringing it all into its fulfillment in Christ, and then saying to his audience, urging his audience onwards in their Christian lives. And at the end of it all, we saw the other day that there's a reference to Timothy at the end, who has been released from prison. And there is this great plea in chapter 13 and verse 18, pray for us, for we are confident that we have a good conscience in all things, desiring to live honorably. For I especially urge you to do this, that I may be restored to you the sooner. Now, who's the preacher? The preacher says he wants to be restored to his audience the sooner. And the word for restored there means to be released. So he's in prison. So our preacher, is he delivering a sermon? But whatever he's doing, and this is definitely sermonic in its form, he seems to be in prison. And when he then says in verse, where are we? Verse 23, know that our brother Timothy has been set free. And then he says, with whom I shall see you if he comes shortly. He seems, our preacher, to have been in prison with Timothy at the same time. And then Timothy is released. And so we can tell his audience, oh, look, Timothy's been released, by the way. He was there, you know, our preacher was there. He was with Timothy and he saw Timothy being released. And then he's saying that his hope is that he too, one day, will be released and he'll be able to meet his audience along with Timothy. So he's Timothy's fellow prisoner. We seem to know that much about him. But when it comes to his original identity, that's where the questions are to be found. And the early church fathers, who were there in the first centuries after the formation of the New Testament church, they all seem to have come to the conclusion that it's not Paul. Even though Paul had been in prison, and we know that he was in prison when he wrote Ephesians and Colossians, and then for a second time when he wrote the pastorals, those early church fathers seem to be of the view that it's not the Apostle Paul. So we then have to think about who was it then. Last thing, there's a lot of Old Testament references. He's showing that Christ, the high priest, after the order of Melchizedek, is fully in keeping with Old Testament teaching. And he's also very much focused on Second Temple Judaism. Do you remember when they returned from Babylon and you've got Nehemiah and Ezra and they rebuild the temple, a small, insignificant temple? He's very much, this preacher, thinking about what that Second Temple period was like. and the importance of scripture in the Second Temple. And so he's drawing on that background. But the great thrust of what he has to say is Jesus solves all the weaknesses and all the failures of that first covenant, and he has issued in a better covenant through his own blood and through the power of an endless life. And that's Hebrews.